This video essay aims to provide an overview of the current research on the genetic modification of organisms in human food as part of the Mills Archive Trust's work on the topic of feeding the world, particularly in the face of predicted climate change. Genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, are organisms which have had their genetic material altered by humans in a way which would not occur in the natural world, often for a specific desired characteristic. Genetic modification allows for the transfer of DNA between unrelated species to produce a more useful trait in the modified organism. Genetic modification has increasingly been used in recent decades within the agricultural industry, often to produce crops with higher yields, resistance to pests and diseases, resistance to herbicides and stress, and to increase the nutritional value of the product. While GMOs may seem revolutionary in the development of agriculture, with some suggesting they may take a key role in ensuring food security, particularly under the conditions of a changing climate, the genetic modification of human food sources is a highly controversial topic, with many people and organisations strongly opposing GM products entering the commercial market. The human manipulation of genetic properties of food sources is actually not as recent a development as you might think. For centuries, humans have been carefully selectively breeding species of plants and animals in efforts to optimise production and nutritional value, which has resulted in the generational evolution of crops and livestock into what they are today. During the 20th century, technological advances massively contributed to the rise in crop yields, which is widely known as the Green Revolution, or Third Agricultural Revolution. At this time, scientists began to increasingly crossbreed between species, optimizing their properties and producing larger quantities. Perhaps the most famous instance of this was agronomist Norman Borlaug's development of dwarf wheat during the 1960s, which earned him a Nobel Peace Prize due to his contribution to alleviating world hunger. Tall wheat species, which were commonly grown before Borlaug's crossbreeding, had a lower yield than others since their stems were not strong enough to support heavier grains and they frequently fell over under windy conditions, resulting in large yield losses. Borlaug was able to introduce wheat dwarfing genes from a semi-dwarf wheat variety into the higher yielding but taller American variety, resulting in a high yielding, shorter stemmed wheat which could better withstand wind. The development of technology which led to the transfer of genetic material between such crops is widely credited for the large increase in wheat production in developing countries such as India, as the graph in Figure 1 demonstrates, which led to the subsequent alleviation of famine in areas of the world. This graph was taken from one of Norman Borlaug's own journal articles. The main difference between this previous genetic changing of food sources and that of GMO products is that much of GMO engineering is conducted at a cellular level and results in rapid production of new species rather than being produced generationally over decades. Genetic engineering also allows for the introduction of DNA from one organism to another which could not naturally occur. Many oppose the use of GMOs in human food due to this unnaturalness and fear their entry into the commercial market, but they may be unaware of how genetically manipulated non-GMO crops also are after generations of selectively breeding by humans, as these crops too do not resemble a crop which would naturally occur without human intervention. Public unawareness of natural spontaneous mutations and the evolution of crops may be contributing to fear surrounding GMOs, and perhaps if this was more widely known, there would be less skepticism surrounding genetic engineering in food. Much of the argument in favour of the use of GMOs in food production surrounds the possibility for crops to be genetically engineered to better withstand the changing weather and precipitation conditions that are anticipated with the changing of climate. Predicted rising temperatures are likely to lead to drought in areas of the world, and scientists suggest that with biotechnology, crops could be genetically modified to better tolerate drought and increase their yields in drier conditions. It is also suggested that crops could be engineered to improve their ability to capture carbon from the atmosphere and reduce the necessity of tillage farming, which would reduce greenhouse gases. Engineering could also lead to yield increases, which would mean that less land would be required for agriculture, resulting in a decrease in carbon dioxide emissions, as 30% of the emissions released in agriculture are attributed to land use change. Though they are still largely commercially unavailable, many studies have been conducted into the potential for genetically modified crops to provide a solution to growing concerns surrounding food insecurity associated with changing global temperatures. A maize trial in 2007, which involved the transfer of a glutamate dehydrogenase gene from E. coli into maize, resulted in the maize having a higher tolerance to water deficit under controlled conditions. Furthermore, the transfer of genes from sunflowers has reported to induce drought tolerance in soybean, and a gene from E. coli has been reported to increase stress tolerance in sugarcane. Both soybeans and sugarcane are highly relied upon by humans as sources of food, and in the areas where they are currently predominantly grown, expected temperatures are likely to lead to a decline in productivity with the crops that are currently grown there. One of the main concerns surrounding the introduction of GMOs into the human food market is the impact on human health. Upon hearing the phrase genetic modification, many would picture unnatural crops with dangerous, uncontrolled mutations, with negative implications for human health. In the media, GMOs have been referred to as frankenfoods, further contributing to concerns that the consumption of such products could lead to an increase in diseases such as cancers or other long-term health complications, but this is largely due to anti-GMO campaigns suggesting that this is a likely possibility. Despite these health concerns, there is currently no evidence that GM foods can cause cancer in humans, and there's no reasonable explanation for how this could occur. And since their introduction into the US food market in the 1990s, there has not been an increase in cancer linked to their consumption. Another significant concern raised by GMO critics is the way in which large companies have used biotechnology to generate profit rather than prioritizing food security. Corporations and large agrochemical companies have patented their GMO seeds, meaning that farmers wanting to use them are not allowed to save them for future planting and must buy expensive seeds every year. This business tactic particularly disadvantages small farmers and has been described as aggressive, giving GMOs a bad reputation. This leads some to suggest that science communicators should aim to reduce misinformation surrounding the products themselves and instead direct public skepticism towards the management of the products. In the book The End of Plenty by Joel Bourne, it was suggested that despite having the potential to benefit malnourished children or subsistence farmers in developing nations, genetically engineered crops have instead been used to generate profit for biotech companies and commercial farmers, who, according to some agricultural academics, will not do research in the public interest. The book further claims that biotech companies focus on developing crops that sell more seeds, pesticides, and create more profit, and through the protection of their patents, restrict the flow of genetic material to public researchers. Golden rice is a key example of a genetically modified crop created to provide more adequate nutrition in areas where vitamin A deficiency is prevalent. The rice was genetically engineered to create a new biochemical pathway providing a source of beta-carotene, which helps to prevent vitamin A deficiency, which results in improved growth, development, and healthier immune and visual systems in humans. 3 genes that help the manufacturing of beta-carotene in rice have been engineered to prevent the removal of the beta-carotene from the rice husks during the milling process, and it is believed that if introduced in areas of the world where the diet is predominantly rice-based, occurrences of vitamin A deficiency, and therefore cases of childhood blindness and poor immune systems, will decrease significantly. Despite being developed in the 1990s, golden rice is yet to be released into the consumer market due to the multiple obstacles it faces being a genetically modified product. The environmental campaigning groups Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth have continually protested against the release of the rice as part of their anti-GMO campaigns, where concerns were raised regarding the use of pesticides and threats to biodiversity and human health arising from GM crops. Much of the environmental campaigning against GMO food has been in protest of large corporations controlling farmers and patenting seeds and crops, but the consequences of such campaigns have led to not-for-profit organisations such as the Golden Rice Project being unable to contribute to global food security and the improvement of health. This is said to be putting millions of lives at risk, and Adrian Dubok, a board member of the Golden Rice Project, expressed his frustrations at anti-GMO campaigns. He stated that planting golden rice was not being done for profit. Nobody was trying to control what farmers grow or control what people eat. It was being done to save lives. Like Duboc, many scientists criticise the populist environmental campaigns that have little scientific input, which put pressure on governments who then enforce strong regulations on GMO products or even outlaw them entirely. They see such campaigns as a barrier to ensuring food security. Since their creation, those in favour of GMOs have always suggested that they have the possibility to reduce global famine significantly. Their potential to produce higher yields and be developed to grow under specific conditions means that areas struggling with producing enough nutritious food may benefit from their use. When an El Niño-induced drought affected areas of Africa, which as a result had to receive an increased amount of imported food, bans were imposed against the transportation of GMO food aid, despite starving populations. Concerns over the contamination of local crops and the effects on native biodiversity and citizens' health meant that in countries such as Zimbabwe, the importation of GM grains was made illegal and was closely monitored by the National Biotechnology Authority. Eventually, due to the rising levels of hunger, it was accepted that GMOs could be used in Malawi, Mozambique and Zimbabwe as long as the grains had been milled upon entry to ensure they would not be planted. But this meant that these countries remained unable to produce their own sufficient food supplies and were reliant on international aid, despite the suggestion that if GMOs were grown in these countries, they would be able to maintain their own food supplies. Overall, it seems that despite being around for decades, little progress has been made in the introduction of GMOs into the human diet. Due to strict regulations, environmental and health campaigns, and fears over corporate control over agriculture, GMOs have failed to have been implemented on the scale at which they were intended. Those who support the development of genetic engineering in food have long argued that without the continuous genetic changes to crops made by humans, the wheat that is consumed today would simply not exist, as it is far from its natural form. Therefore, we should not be afraid of so-called unnatural GMO products. With no proven negative health implications for humans, it is argued that criticisms of GMOs should be focused not on the diseases that they are basically claimed to lead to, but instead on the large companies who may be prioritising the use of the products to generate wealth rather than contribute to food security and provide climate adaptation potential. Criticisms of the products must still be heard and considered, but perhaps rather than treating GMOs as one homogeneous group and either accepting or rejecting them all, they should be investigated on a case-by-case basis and carefully tested to ensure that they are not detrimental to humans or the environment. Furthermore, to address concerns regarding the role of big biotech companies in the patenting and profit-driven production, it has been suggested that there should be an increased role of the public sector in the development of new varieties, which should prioritise long-term needs of society, instead of the technology being primarily driven by a small handful of breeding companies which tend to focus on short-term earnings. To learn more about the possibilities surrounding genetic modification, as well as the arguments for and against the process, the Mills Archive Trust has a variety of sources containing further information. As well as previously mentioned books such as The End of Plenty by Joel Bourne, the archive holds copies of Hannah Ritchie's Not the End of the World, which discusses genetic modification and the role of Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution in the movement towards global food security, in its food and climate change chapters. The archive also has a wide collection of magazines spanning decades, including the Milling and Grain magazine, formerly the Grain and Feed Milling Technology magazine, which displays the progression in agricultural use of genetic engineering throughout time. This magazine is the descendant of Milling, a journal established in 1891 to inform the UK milling industry. The Trust has many of these issues and plans to digitise some of them in future funded projects. The publishers of Milling and Grain, Perrindale Publishers, are an archive patron.